Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Lenny Lapato, and I'm a program coordinator with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you to everyone who's able to join us today to discuss the significant increase in the migration of LGBTQ people from Russia and other post-Soviet states to the United States and the factors behind it. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage everyone to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, the Focus Ukraine blog, the Russia File blog, and our Russian language blog, in other words. You can also subscribe to our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File. I'd like also to take a moment to thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for their generous support of several of the Kennan Institute's fellowships, which has allowed us to host rising scholars in the field, such as our guest today, Dr. Alexandra Novitskaya. So also, we have an online audience, and I encourage everyone to submit their questions for our speaker. If you're watching online, you can do so via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via our Twitter account at the Kennan Institute, or on the Kennan Institute's Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. So, now it's my pleasure to introduce Alexandra Novitskaya. Dr. Novitskaya is currently a Title VIII research scholar with the Kennan Institute and was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Robert F. Burns Russian and East European Institute at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. She holds a PhD in women's, gender, and sexuality studies from Stony Brook University, and her research interests include queer migration, political asylum, LGBTQ human rights, and the geopolitics of homo and transphobia. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lenny, so much. Thank you for the warm introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. Excellent. So, well, let's get started. Thank you again for coming, joining us today to listen to my talk titled Queer Dissidents, Geopolitics and the Infrastructure of Post-Soviet LGBTQ Migration. So a few words about the project. This is my book project, still in progress. And what I've been doing for the past what I've been doing since 2016 is conducting an ethnographic participant observation research with a group of, a community of immigrants, primarily LGBTQ asylum seekers, right? So from countries formerly in the Soviet Union, mostly Russia, but also other countries such as Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, who had to leave their countries of origin and who came to the United States, to New York City, to apply for political asylum. As I said, I've been doing a participant observation of this community, that is attending their meetings in public and in person and private meetings. I collected over 30 in-depth biographical interviews with migrants and asylum seekers, asking them to tell me about share their life stories with me. I also conducted analysis of social media, these asylum seekers' use of social media and online forums, just to get an idea, a better understanding of what it means to be an LGBTQ asylum seeker from Russia or other countries formerly in the Soviet Union in the United States currently. And I was interested in understanding better what drives this migration, what challenges the LGBTQ migrants face before, during, and after arriving in the United States. And also, most importantly, how migration influences their identities, their understanding of who they are, their community building and activist practices. What does it mean, like I said, to be an LGBTQ asylum seeker? But also, is it working? Yes, excellent. Also, I want to place today's conversation in the context of global polarization over LGBTQ rights. That's worldwide. Here I have a map of the European Union, where you can see, I think, that countries in the West, right, and the north of Europe are, let's call them Rainbow Europe, right, the gay-friendly Europe, while everything else to the right, that is Eastern and south of Europe, is maybe not so rainbow. And with the exception of Italy and maybe Greece, you can also notice that the not so LGBTQ-friendly countries in the European Union are the more recent EU members, formerly post-socialist, well, formerly socialist countries that reject LGBTQ equality. And so by polarization, scholars mean that currently many countries in the so-called global north extend full citizenship rights to LGBTQ citizens. That is the right to marry, to have a family, children, to just be a full citizen. At the same time, to the point that even sometimes this country is accused of being homo-nationalist, that is, appropriating LGBTQ progress, the progress in LGBTQ rights, to position themselves as just really great countries, right? Exceptionally accepting and progressive and tolerant. At the same time, countries mostly in the global south often reject or maybe even outright repress LGBTQ equality in what some scholars have called heteronationalism, or I prefer the term state-sponsored homo and transphobia. I think it applies to Russia, which is my main interest here, and I'll talk about it in a second more. And quite often, this process of polarization has post-colonial and decolonial undertones, because countries that are currently framed as the most homophobic ones are more often than not former colonies of Western countries. And so they may view LGBTQ equality as a continuation of the colonial imposition on their own culture and traditions, which is ironic, given that, again, in countries like Uganda, for example, that is often in the news as being a prime example of post-colonial and highly oppressive toward LGBTQ people society, only, has its anti-gay laws because of the colonial past, because when Uganda was the British colony, it received a law, a statute that was very similar to the British anti-sodomy statutes of the time. But that's, so you see that it's a complicated and multi-layered process. But then, to get back to what we are here to talk about, how does the global polarization over LGBTQ rights work for Russia and post-Soviet and also post-socialist states like the ones on this map, which have mostly never been Western colonies? So therefore, and yet, as you, I'm sure, are all aware, Russia presents a really fairly extreme case of going from bad to worse for LGBTQ rights. So I'm going to go to my next slide and show you a fragment of the recent ruling of the Russian Supreme Court regarding whether, quote-unquote, an international LGBTQ movement is extremist. And yes, spoiler alert, the court ruled that, yes, the international LGBTQ movement is indeed an extremist organization or movement, and as such must be banned in Russia. Let alone the fact that there's no such thing as one unified international LGBTQ movement. I will not burden you with reading like line to line of this ruling, but you can see here, right? You can see the bolded, the fragments of text in bold, that this ruling frames LGBTQ advocacy as a primarily Western intervention in Russia's domestic politics. Again, we don't need to go in too much detail over the justification for why LGBTQ advocacy is extremist. I mean, you can look and you can see that according to the Russian Supreme Court, the international LGBTQ movement is a destructive ideological mechanism of influence, right? It threatens the country's demography, population numbers, that is. It harms people's moral health, etc. At the same time, it also emerged in the United States as a part of birth rate restriction policy, and in Russia, LGBTQ advocacy only exists because of the foreign influence, right? Because of the foreign funding and so on. And so I read, and I invite you to read with me, this framing of LGBTQ advocacy as a geopolitical, right? As a geopolitical framing, yes, not rather than a post-colonial rejection of LGBTQ equality. And but then what does it mean for the actual LGBTQ people on the ground? And I'm going to go to my next slide. Okay. So what the Supreme Court ruling, which happened in November last year, and then the text that I show you was made public, I think, in January this year, is currently the pinnacle, right, the peak of a fairly long process of, like I said, things in Russia going from bad to worse for LGBTQ rights. And in migration scholarship, we call reasons and factors, right, that motivate people leave their countries of origin, push factors. And so, again, I do not have too much time, unfortunately, to go into detail, but probably many are aware that in Russia, state-sponsored homophobia has been a thing, an unofficial state policy, if you like, since at least 2011 to 2012, when first several regions in Russia began to propose and successfully ban the so-called propaganda of homosexuality. And then in 2013, this ban was made federal, and at the time it only applied to minors. So it was a censorship ban, censorship law that prohibited any positive information about LGBTQ identities in the presence of minors, that is anyone under the age of 18. And this law, despite being a symbolic censorship law, of course, has had multiple long-lasting consequences and implications by othering LGBTQ Russians, right, by sort of making them into second-class citizens, and thus provoking violence and discrimination against them, and motivating some, those who can, to leave. In 2022, the gay propaganda law was extended onto the entire public sphere in Russia. That is, that now it is impossible to talk about, to show a movie featuring LGBTQ characters, or maybe even to broadcast the Eurovision song contest in Russia. Not that they would do it anyway, given the geopolitical situation at the time, currently. But due to Russia's influence in the region, countries like Moldova, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, even Ukraine before the Revolution of Dignity tried to adopt similar gay propaganda legislations. Right now, actually, Georgia is considering a similar legislation to ban the so-called gay propaganda. And so that's to say that LGBTQ people all over the region felt the ripples, right? The ripples of the state-sponsored homophobia in Russia. And and then in 2023, I should also not forget to mention, Russia banned gender transition entirely, right? That's denying healthcare to, possibly millions of people, healthcare that in many cases is absolutely necessary to transgender people to just live their lives, to survive. And, but so what it all does is that, the first thing is the effect of this vast campaign is that LGBTQ people now really are pushed out of the region, and discursively. And also, for example, the Supreme Court ruling that I already mentioned makes LGBTQ advocacy in Russia impossible, right? So it makes any sort of resistance quite difficult. And so that inevitably motivates people to leave, right? Because people vote with their feet, right? When they cannot, when they feel like they have very limited options otherwise. And here I will show you a couple of quotes from the respondents that I interviewed for my project several years ago. And you can also see that when I asked Anya, who was originally from St. Petersburg, to tell me whether she'd experienced any homophobia when she lived in Russia, and she was like, well, of course I have, right? But then, interestingly, when I asked her to tell me a little more, she began to talk about politics, right? And she said, oh, yes, it's almost like the state tries to make us into the scapegoat, us, the LGBTQ community. And you can see in this quote, right, as she said, it's as if people are being wound up on purpose. All these articles and discussions of how gays and lesbians cannot be teachers or work with children, how is it related? But people believe in it and play along, and they say, well done, Putin, Crimea is ours. Gays are to blame for everything. So just in one breath, Anya gave me a little snapshot of her experience with homophobia when she lived in Russia, and you can see that it's a political homophobia, right? And maybe even a geopolitical homophobia, because not only she felt that the LGBTQ community was being scapegoated and really like was under attack, but also that these attacks were fueled by by nationalism, right, and support for the government, for Putin, and for the occupation of Crimea, which was still recent at the time of the interview in 2018. And then another respondent, originally from Belarus, talked about Russia's influence on domestic policies in Belarus, and including homophobia in Belarus, which is also a self-evident quote here. And I heard similar statements repeatedly from respondents from countries not other than Russia, from Uzbekistan to Kazakhstan, and so on. And so that is push factors, right? So obviously, state-sponsored homophobic campaigns also, as they overlap with the everyday prejudice, because I'm not saying that Russia used to be a very gay-friendly place before 2013 and 2014. It was not. So it makes it difficult for people to stay and to live a livable life. And so those who can't afford it turn to migration. And at the same time, I'm often asked, why the United States, right? Why would the people from Russia or Ukraine try to make it like so far, right? So far away from their countries of origin, and come to the United States, and so it is, again. It's not like I can give you one easy and straightforward answer to this question, but I do want to encourage you to think about the role of geopolitics again, the Russia-U.S. relations, in why LGBTQ migrants might want to choose the United States. And here's what I mean by this. So pull factors, right? Again, the reasons for why migrants choose one destination and not the other. In the interviews with asylum seekers and immigrants, both who just arrived in the United States when I was collecting the interviews, and those who had left there for quite some time sometimes, I often heard a lot of praise for the country as really a source of recognition and safety for LGBTQ people. And I will give you some quotes later on. But I want, right now, what I want to focus on is actually, yes, the US-Russia geopolitics, or what I like to call the sexual geopolitics. In 2011, just as people in many Russian cities in December were protesting the results of the Duma elections, which many viewed as fraudulent, right? Because the ruling party, the United Russia, won overwhelmingly, which did not match the people's expectations. Just as the mass protest was happening, and the LGBTQ activists in St. Petersburg, my hometown, and other cities in Russia also joined these mass opposition protests for the first time, actually, in history. Then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton gave a talk at the UN headquarters in Geneva on the International Human Rights Day, also in December. And that is when she gave what many now call a historic speech, LGBT rights or human rights, in which she acknowledged that yes, LGBTQ people worldwide were often facing discrimination and violence, and proclaimed the United States to be a new global leader in LGBTQ advocacy. And even said, right, here I have this quote, and I'm going to again bold it a little bit, and I will read it to you. Finally, to LGBT men and women worldwide, let me say this. Wherever you live and whatever the circumstances of your life, you have an ally in the United States of America, and you have millions of friends among the American people. So that is again, when I gave when I talked about my research before, some people in the audience would say, this is like a dog whistle, right? And I'd say, well, yes, maybe it was, right, in a way, because it sort of sounded a little bit like an invitation, right? So like, yes, you can, if you are discriminated, if you are oppressed and marginalized in your home country, you can try and come to the United States and apply for asylum, for example, and we'll welcome you here. And again, speaking to asylum seekers, I would often hear responses along the lines of like, yes, we came to the United States because we thought we'd have a safe and dignified life here. But I will give you a couple of quotes later. But so also what happened, yes, and so here's my definition of sexual geopolitics, because I think that the speech should be understood as an example of such too, right? A strategic appropriation or misappropriation of sexual citizenship rights, including LGBTQ and women's rights, by global actors such as superpowers, right, intergovernmental entities, and certain nation states, in order to position themselves on the global stage, especially vis-a-vis other such actors. In 2011, Secretary Clinton proclaimed that LGBT rights are human rights. My hometown of St. Petersburg was considering to pass a gay propaganda law. And the local activist community made a big deal out of it, trying to publicize the ridiculousness that was the law project, was the proposal, and also trying to resist it. And there was indeed a lot of coverage in the international media of the law, and it might have reached the Department of State. And although I do not want to claim that this is exactly what happened, but I think it's possible that why would Secretary Clinton talk about LGBTQ rights in 2011 when the United States, this country, hadn't even had marriage equality yet, right, and would not have had it for another 4 years, for example. Anyway. And then we also have rainbow diplomacy, which is, so what happened the next day, well, literally the next day in December 2011, is that the White House posted a memo directing all U.S. agencies abroad to start supporting local LGBTQ initiatives around the globe where they were, and supporting and promoting them. And so now we often have cases where U.S. embassies or consulates try to wave the rainbow flag during the Pride Month in June, although it has been controversial, and I think just recently, a couple months ago, during the negotiations to prevent the government shutdown, the Republican Party negotiated that there would be no such practice anymore. So you can see that it's still, again, it's not a straightforward process, even coming from where it should be coming from the U.S., from within the government, right? So like it's not like there's unity on this issue of whether the United States and its government are indeed global leaders in LGBTQ advocacy. Let's put it this way. But what interests me is how rainbow diplomacy played out in Russia. Well, it played out there quite extensively. So. Again, in 2012, Michael McFaul was appointed the ambassador to Russia. And as soon as he arrived in Moscow, he began to engage the civil society and the opposition, including LGBTQ activists and advocates, meeting with them, meeting with local LGBTQ groups in Russia during his travels. He met with LGBTQ activists in St. Petersburg when he was there. Then in 2013, during the G20 summit, he organized a meeting of Russian LGBTQ advocates with President Obama. Here I have a photo from that meeting, and you can see President Obama in the middle, and then McFaul to the right. And yes, and some actually people that I even know personally sitting around this table with her. And so McFaul also popularized American LGBTQ history. He, on his social media, he wrote about the Stonewall Rise on his blog, trying to frame this history as a part of American values and freedom, right, and democracy. And so, how do you think the Kremlin responded, right, to McFaul's support for Russian LGBTQ advocates? Well, it responded by viewing them as foreign agents, those who receive a lot of support from Russia's arch enemy, the United States. And so, in the interest of time, I will tell you about one person I interviewed for this project, and I will call him Mark. So 10 years ago, actually, in 2013, 2014, Mark was in his early 30s. He lived in a mid-sized Russian city in Far East. Worked at a university, was in graduate school, and also he was not out as a gay man, but at the same time he managed to like double in activism on the side in community building. He ran a small support group for other LGBTQ people in his city. During Markfall's tenure and the time of rainbow diplomacy, Mark met with a representative of the Freedom House, the NGO that was at the time still active in Russia, who began to invite him, who saw in him, a civil society activist, right, an LGBTQ activist, and so he began to invite Mark to various events sponsored by the United States, including a meeting with Michael Markfall. So, okay, I hope you can read. But so what happened is that as soon as Mark met with, he attended a general meeting, just being one of the many local representatives of the civil society. Immediately after the meeting, he received a call from a person who turned out to be an FSB operative, who invited Mark also to a meeting that Mark could not refuse for obvious reasons. And so at the meeting, the FSB officer questioned Mark about the Markfall event. He asked him, so were you there? Did you speak to him? What did you guys talk about? At first, Mark answered some of his questions. Then he felt that maybe the officer was being too intrusive and really why him, and so he refused to speak to him in the end. And the officer did not like that at all and actually threatened Mark. He said to him, I will read the last sentence in this quote, "You are acting very unpatriotically and you will have problems in the future." And indeed, Mark did have serious problems in the future, which was that he was outed in a local newspaper as an LGBTQ activist who was, again, according to the newspaper, connected to this Department of State, right, and to the United States, and who was promoting the gay propaganda and also working at a university and was a gay man. So like he was outed like in the most terrible and violent way. Immediately, Mark lost his job. He was fired. He lost housing. He felt that he might have been surveilled, placed under surveillance. He lost his social networks, really, people, his friends, they turned away from him. And absolutely terrified, he decided that he had to flee, he had to leave Russia, and so he came to the United States and applied for asylum. He struggled a lot. So he lost everything in Russia. He had to start from scratch in the U.S. It took him years to apply to receive political asylum. He lost his relationship, his family, who stayed in Russia and did not join him. He also discovered that in the United States, no NGO was actually interested in him when he was now an asylum seeker, rather than a representative of the Russian civil society, an LGBTQ activist. So he was quite disappointed and traumatized by this experience. And that is a common story. So I'm, again, talking about just one because I don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, here. But even I interviewed several people who used to be activists in Russia, and even those who never had any contacts with the United States, its representative, its governmental officials, no one, they still often were suspected of actually having some contacts. And they reviewed with suspicion as foreign agents, as traitors, other people, again, people who never had any contacts with the United States would also run into the FSB surveillance and who would be threatened by the FSB up to the point of leaving. And even those who were not ever activists, they also still felt that it was closing in, right? They didn't feel safe and had to leave. But so what happens in the end is that when people from like Mark come to the United States and apply for political asylum, they face an extreme immigrant precarity. For those, and very briefly, for those who may not know, right? So an LGBTQ person to receive political asylum in the U.S. has to prove two things. First, that they are indeed who they say they are, that is a lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender person, and that is their identity. And B, that they either have been persecuted and faced violence, experienced violence because of who they are, their identity, or that they have a credible fear that this might happen to them, which again, in reality translates to, it translates to an unpredictable and traumatizing process because so they basically have to prove that they are not liars, right? That they are not making things up about their experiences. At the same time, also in the United States, asylum seekers do not receive or receive very little, I guess, currently of support, like financial support from the state. They're on their own. They do not often do not have any work authorization papers, documents that would help them, so they have to work informally. Again, rely only on themselves and their own community. And the wait times in the United States for asylum interviews are extremely long. Some people I met and interviewed for this project in 2018 are still, and who by then had been in the U.S. maybe for 1 year or 2 years waiting for their interview, are still in the United States waiting for their interviews 6 years later. And just think of what it does to a person, right? This wait time. So I would ask questions about future plans, or like, what do you want from life? What do you expect? And people would say to me, I don't know what to expect. I've trained myself not to think about future at all, because as long as my asylum case isn't resolved, I don't know what my future is going to be like. I better not think about it at all and live in the present. But how much can you do this for how long, and what kind of toll does it takes on the person? And the last slide before conclusions is about why does the migration continue? Because it does. And often people ask me about why asylum seekers come to New York City and not, say, Cleveland, Ohio. And so I thought I may as well just preempt the question and answer it before you ask. And the answer would be relatively simple. It's because of the pre-existing infrastructures of migration, right? Such as diasporic spaces, right? Pre-established diasporic communities, as in New York City for Russian-speaking immigrants, Brighton Beach and other areas. Also, LGBTQ-friendly spaces, and especially the LGBTQ diaspora that has already formed in New York over the past 10 years, are extremely important for new immigrants. But the last idea that I'd like you to have today as a takeaway is that the discursive ideas and expectations, and maybe even the way asylum seekers imagine the United States to be, also matter. They play a role in their investment in why they want to come here and not somewhere else. And I think in my research, I see that the rainbow diplomacy, right, and the U.S.-Russia sexual geopolitics also play a role in how and why LGBTQ migrants and asylum seekers see the United States as the place they want to be in. And here's the last quote that I will give you from Katya, who is originally from Moscow and is married, has a wife, and she and her wife have been together for a very long time. Before I asked Katya to tell me why she decided to immigrate to the United States. And she told me a story that before immigration, she and her wife were part of an LGBTQ advocacy group, or community center rather. And during Obama's second term, they noticed that the consul, right, the U.S. consul in their city, which was not Moscow, began to attend their meetings and also host events and invite them to these meetings. As Katya said, that this American diplomat and his wife, they were such amazing people. They were the first people ever to notice me and my wife as a couple and to treat us as such. And it affected us very strongly, because before we used to be invisible to others, that is, right? And naturally, that's how we saw that the Americans accepted us. The thing is, I remember there was an event commemorating the Stonewall. So again, note the appropriation of the Stonewall history, right, by the U.S. Diplomatic mission. Okay, continuing. And the diplomat said to us, America supports you. We are with you. You have us to turn to. And basically, that was an open call. Perhaps at this moment, I decided that I want to go precisely to America. So you can see how rainbow diplomacy, right, on the one hand, promotes the United States as a place of refuge for asylum seekers and for LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers. But it also may contribute to the domestic repression of these very people, right? Prompting some to emigrate, but also leaving the rest to a precarious and very difficult existence. because as in the Russian case, LGBTQ people have really become associated with being like traitors, foreigners in their own land. People, foreign agents on the State Department payroll, which is not really true. Yeah. Oh, and I should mention that as soon as President Trump was elected, all the rainbow diplomacy programs were immediately placed on hold. There was no more funding to support local LGBTQ causes around the world, right, by U.S. diplomats, and the diplomats were instructed to drop it, essentially. And some Russian LGBTQ activists who I interviewed also mentioned that, like, they used to rely on this funding that they could receive and some support, and then after 2017, that was no longer there. And so I would like to leave us all with some questions that we could ponder, like what should we do? Because how should the U.S. government support international LGBTQ advocacy? Because I'm not saying that it shouldn't, right? But I think it should be done in some different way. And I'm still pondering on how exactly it can be done to do more, well, to avoid causing more harm than good. Especially in contexts and in regions and countries such as Russia, where anti-American sentiments are so strong currently, that again, these sentiments in the end essentially turn onto their own people, who are already vulnerable. Thank you so much. Should we stop it?
Thank you, Alex. And we're going to move to the discussion portion of today's event. But first, if you're watching online, I'd like to remind you that we encourage your questions for our speaker. You can submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter account at Kennan Institute, or at the Kennan Institute's Facebook page. Please make sure to include your name and affiliation when you send your question. So Alex, to kick off the discussion, I like the way that you frame this issue because you offer an approach both from an individual and relationship level all the way up to state geopolitics. So my first sort of question is building off of the policy questions that you leave at the end of your presentation, sort of focusing on the idea of rainbow diplomacy and acknowledging that in the case of Russia, the state has used U.S. diplomacy efforts as a way or as justification for persecuting LGBTQ citizens. What have we learned from the past over a decade of this sort of new version of rainbow diplomacy? How can we make it better and possibly mitigate harm?
Thank you so much for your question, Lenny. Well, one thing I learned is that over the past 10 years, like I said in the end of my talk, U.S. rainbow diplomacy has been intermittent, right? It was there before President Trump was elected, then it was not there for the next 4 years. Although, for example, during Trump's time in office, U.S. diplomats were instructed. Actually, they were prohibited explicitly from flying the rainbow flags during the Pride months over U.S. premises. However, some diplomats still, defied the prohibition and did fly the flags in Brazil, I think, But that's not just about the flag. The flag is symbolic, it's there, it's visible, but also it's about funding, right? It's about support for actual local LGBTQ causes and initiatives that from 2011 to 2016, right, to the late 2016 was there, right? And then during Trump's time, it wasn't, and then once President Biden was elected, the funding was reinstated, and so for now it continues. But what will happen in another several months after the elections in this fall, I have no way of predicting. Well, I guess I have some thoughts, but yes, that they would not surprise you. What the second thing that I think. Well, I think it's possible I think it's important to keep supporting civil society initiatives, not just LGBTQ causes, but civil society overall. But it has to be done in clandestine ways, quiet and clandestine ways, and maybe without a lot of boasting, without a lot of rhetorical accompaniment, without a lot of rhetorical framing that, yes, Ambassador McFaul used to deploy a lot, which is in the United States, we are so democratic, we're so great, we love freedom here, and so we support LGBTQ human rights because it's an American thing to do. I am paraphrasing, but yes, you can find his old Life Journal blog and find those quotes. So I think maybe continue the support, but drop the rhetoric for the time being, especially where it's clear that this rhetoric would just be misinterpreted, right, by adversarial governments like that in Russia.
Okay, and I would also like to ask about the designation of the international LGBTQ movement as an extremist group last year, and whether that's had any repercussions for people who are seeking asylum, whether it's an increase in seeking asylum, or perhaps procedurally it makes it harder or easier if you've received that designation from your own government to seek asylum in a foreign country.
So I think that procedurally it actually should make things easier for asylum seekers from Russia, because basically now all they need to do is just to argue that their very identities are outlawed. Yeah, some of my colleagues and other scholars of LGBTQ studies in Russia, they even argue that even though Russia still hasn't outright criminalized homosexuality, it has done so. Basically, it has done so, but in a covert way, right? Not by criminalizing acts, but by actual behavior, right? But by criminalizing or outlawing identities, because it is now really impossible, or would be costly, to even say that LGBTQ people have the same rights or are equal to everyone else. That could be considered extremist. So if an asylum seeker can prove or demonstrate this at their hearing, at their interview, I think, again, I cannot predict how it would go, because there's so many different little. I was, as a part of the field work, I was at asylum interviews as an interpreter, and so I observed it happen, and I can say, yes, things could go in many different ways, and it's so unpredictable, because a lot of the success or the lack of in an asylum interview depends on individual, on personal, just on who gets to interview you, and how you present yourself, and whether this person is in a good mood even, and on that day. Well, anyway. And so there's not a lot of, they're trying to be objective, but there are a lot of subjective factors at play too during asylum interviews. But the biggest problem for asylum seekers, not just from Russia, but from other post-Soviet countries too, is just getting here, coming to the United States and being able to cross the border and apply for asylum. Because when I conducted most interviews and did most of my fieldwork for this project, people could still just, Russians could get a visa, a tourist visa, at an embassy or a consulate somewhere in Russia, and then just fly direct from Moscow to New York and land at JFK and go then find go and start looking for housing and an informal job and a pro bono attorney, right, to start working on their asylum case. Right now it's impossible, because the U.S. embassy, actually the Russian government has shut down American consulates in several Russian cities, and the embassy is not even issuing, it's not issuing tourist visas much. So it's almost impossible to get a tourist visa or any kind of non-immigrant visa from within Russia for anyone, including asylum seekers to be. People have to travel to other countries, which is also difficult because of the war, and many, countries in the EU that share a border with Russia, most of them have now shut down, are not allowing Russians in, even if they have a Schengen visa, unless they have unless it's some specific circumstances. So again, you cannot go to Finland, you cannot go to Poland, you cannot go to any of the Baltic countries. And where does it leave, right? So what people do is that they've been turning to the other, much more precarious route, which is go to Mexico and then try to cross the border there, and that meaning wait for months, right? Live in a tent or in a camp, join the line of everyone else, because that's where asylum seekers are right now. And then and then spent them in detention in an immigration jail, essentially. And so it's been it's been so difficult. And I know that we have others, people at the Wilson Center doing research with Russian immigrants and asylum seekers. The numbers, because of the war, because of the full-scale invasion, the numbers of Russians fleeing Russia and trying to get to the U.S. and apply for asylum, they didn't even just quadruple. They just shot through the roof. It's thousands, tens of thousands of people now who are trying to do it. And if before the full-scale invasion, I used to say that it's possible, we do not have the exact data, but it's possible to say that it's likely that LGBTQ asylum seekers represent a large part of the asylum seekers from Russia. Now I think it's not just them, but it's people fleeing the war and political repression. So it's all, yeah. So the problem is getting here, and this country is not really doing enough for asylum seekers to, not at all.
Well put, and we have not really touched on Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and how it interacts with this issue. I'll remind everyone that I'm happy to take audience questions. I have one online. This is from Nancy Heemstra, the Associate Professor at the Women in Gender and Sexuality Studies Undergraduate Program Director at Stony Brook University. And she would like to know if you have seen sexual geopolitics play out in Russia's war in Ukraine.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you so much for your question. So actually, yes, I have. Again, maybe some people in this audience have heard about it, but even if so, it's worth repeating. In fact, sexual geopolitics featured front and center in Russia's justification for the full-scale invasion. In 2022, just to give you a couple examples, so in 2022, in March, so less than a month into the invasion, Patriarch Kirill, who is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is the largest church in Russia, which is also one of the strongest allies of the government, gave a sermon in which he, among other things, said that basically the full-scale invasion began to protect the people of eastern Ukraine, of the Donbass, from gay pride parades. Because, as he put it, to paraphrase him, people of the Donbass have refused. That's how he put it. Today, there's a new world order in the West, and they are trying to impose it elsewhere. And the symbol of this new world order is the gay pride parade. And the people of Donbass have refused this, and that's why, and they've suffered a great deal, and we're trying to defend them. So obviously, people of the Donbass. Well, I don't think there was ever any attempt to hold a gay pride parade in Donetsk or Luhansk or anywhere in between. And right, and so to claim that this is what they were fighting for, right, or against, rather, that is a little bit, it's a little bit something. And yet, coming from one of the most high-ranking officials, right, from in the country, the head of the church, who probably has a lot of moral authority for many people in Russia, that was a telling sign. And then almost immediately after, also in the early days of the invasion, President Putin himself gave a speech in which he talked about which he accused anti-war Russians, right, of being traitors, and he talked about anti-war Russians as these people who care about Western values, about foie gras and the so-called gender freedoms. And by gender freedoms, we can only guess what he meant, but my guess is that he meant LGBT rights, right, maybe even gender equality. So these gender freedoms, right, and Putin framed these people as he said these are basically traitors. They're traitors. They're not with us at this crucial moment of our, because again, the full-scale invasion in Russia, as I understand it, is being framed in existential terms. It's Russia against the Western world. It's not Russia, bombing hospitals and schools and residential buildings in Ukraine and killing civilians every day. No. It's Russia defending itself, right, from the evil, from the great evil that is the West, NATO, the United States, you name it. The gay pride parade that threatens to destroy its cultural identity, and its very essence.
Okay, we have another question from online. Actually, Nicole Schreiber from the University of Richmond submitted several questions. And I'm going to start with a question about whether asylum seekers, the people that you've interviewed in New York City, were they activists in their home country? And I guess I would add, do they have an activist role after immigrating?
Thank you, Nicole, for your question. So yes, so I've interviewed over, I think, 31 to date people, and of them, maybe about a third had some activist background. But you have to understand that in Russia, activism might mean different things from here, because it may not necessarily be contentious opposition is like public politics out on the streets. Like it's not necessarily someone marching down the street with a banner, right, or chaining themselves to a wall to demand change. An activist could be someone who's just, like I mentioned, one of the respondents, Mark, who just ran a small support group in his hometown, right? So it could be someone who's maybe organizing cultural events, promoting LGBTQ identities, right, and culture, like showing films or hosting public discussions, or someone who runs a community center. That's activism. And yes, I have interviewed people like this, and to answer your question too, I think one of the findings of my study is that the experience of migration compounded or combined with the experience of this targeted and heightened persecution before actually does promote, well, it doesn't turn everyone activist, but it does help people who might have had some predilections, right, to actualize them. And so many asylum seekers do become more active, more as activists, as yeah, let's just call them that. I wanted to say political activists, but it's not always. Let's just activists on behalf of their community, which is now an immigrant LGBTQ community. So yes, this happens. But again, it also happens because there's so little support that asylum seekers can get from this host society, right, from this country once they are here, that they have to mobilize to advocate for themselves. And so I think Nicole would be, and hopefully everyone else would be would be glad to hear that the asylum seekers who arrived in this country about 10 years ago, so who experienced this, well, sort of state surveillance and persecution in Russia and became politicized, right, and came here, some of them were so angry and so like just livid at what had happened to them that they want to change. And they discovered in New York City that many fellow queer LGBTQ immigrants settled in Brighton Beach and other areas with large Russian-speaking diasporas because it was easier in terms of, like I said, infrastructurally, it was easier, like, to find a job, to find housing. But also they discovered there was a lot of still like prejudice in the diaspora, right? A lot of Russian-speaking New Yorkers don't really like queer people. They think LGBTQ is something that happens elsewhere in the United States, right? Like, but not in Brighton Beach. And no, it is true, unfortunately. And so some people I interviewed, they organized pride parades, right? And I have slides, and I think the title slide. I don't know. Should we go to the title slide just to show it? But maybe, right? Oh no, I did it wrong. So yeah, so what they've been doing is that every year in May, and actually it will happen again soon. They've been organizing a pride parade in Brighton Beach, right there on the boardwalk, right there on the boardwalk. That's what it is since 2017. Every year, there's a pride parade. Everyone's welcome to join if you are in the area, just to show the community, right, the larger Russian-speaking diaspora that, yeah, some of them are some of their fellow neighbors and just fellow Russian-speaking immigrants, maybe LGBTQ, and it's all right.
Okay, I see a question in the audience.
Okay. Hi, Alex. My name is Victoria Pardini. I'm a program associate here at Kennan. I hate to kind of divert from the topic specifically of your research, but I do have a few questions that I feel like you'll know the answer to, and I just wanted to address those. So first of all, kind of triangulating your research out from Russia, I'm curious if you've looked at copycat legislation, copycat work that's coming through. I also think specifically in terms of the foreign agents law that passed today in Georgia, how that will impact international LGBTQ plus advocacy groups, such as Tbilisi Pride is very active for a very small community in Georgia, what that will look like, or what you think could happen if you have any contacts in terms of kind of what their sense is for that. And the second question is about the landscape currently in Russia. If you have any, I don't mean to say, reveal your sources, but what the general feeling is since the full-scale invasion. And your question on the last slide mentioned how we can support these groups. And I kind of am curious, your own perspective, like how do we support these groups if, representing them or any kind of advocacy might look to be intrusion and foreign interference or something like that?
These are excellent questions. Thank you so much, Victoria. So as for Georgia and the Tbilisi Pride, I don't think I don't have any data that I could turn to right now, but just as a general feeling, well, I just really hope Georgia is not Russia. And even with this law, right, being passed, I know that one of our scholars here has argued that maybe sometimes the foreign agent law is just about transparency or greater transparency of funding, right, of funding for civil society initiatives. And I'm not sure that this is what Georgia is going for, but perhaps, yes, but like I said, Georgia is not Russia, and it's not a dictatorship, right? And it's not an authoritarian dictatorship yet, and hopefully never will be. And because of this, maybe there still will be enough, checks and balances to counterbalance the law, and including coming from the civil society. It's also possible that because Georgia is not Russia, it may respond to international pressure differently from Russia, and maybe drop the law or not go forward with its own version of the gay propaganda law, which it's also been considering, like we discussed already. But yes, at this point, I don't think I can make any informed, more informed than this answer. Comments on that. And as for the community in Russia, well, the mood is difficult, but the community is resilient. I can talk about I've been following the transgender and gender nonconforming groups in Russia, and I know that they've been highly creative in protecting themselves, at least online. And I will not give examples that would be too specific, but I do want to talk about this one community. And yes, a lot of activism and community building in Russia is happening online today. Even though it used to be safer, now it's not that much safer, unfortunately, but there are still some things people can do online that would be harder to do in person. And so I know that, speaking about, there's this one group, just loosely, let's call it a group, that they've changed their names. They changed their name. They used to be something, transgender and gender nonconforming support group, let's call them that. And then they changed transgender and gender nonconforming to code words. But I'm not going to say which, because again, I don't know if I should be talking about this. But they just changed it to something entirely different, like unrelated to gender, sexuality, anything. Like, I don't know, chair and table or something like that. I'm just looking at this chair and this table, that's why I said that. So the group for chairs and tables, right? But everyone knows, like those who need to know, they do. And they exist, so they have social media, they are present on social media, and they run events, they run online meetings, they do community building, they help transgender and gender nonconforming people survive in Russia when it's become so much harder for them. They help them with things like writing resumes, applying for jobs, right? Or those who are thinking of immigrating, they could help them at least with some advice on that matter. And yes, immigration is a big thing. But again, not everyone. Those you could even get an impression that everyone wants to leave, and maybe the parallel would not be exactly 100% accurate. But I think you could compare the state of LGBTQ people in Russia today to the state of Soviet Jews at the time, right? Where again, immigration sometimes seemed as the only way out the only way out of all the discrimination and anti-Semitism that was so prevalent in the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so many people left back then, but not everyone. And similarly now, those who can, they try to leave, but then there are many people who cannot leave because they're either too young or they have parents, right, that they cannot leave behind, families, or because simply immigration is expensive, very expensive, especially when you're trying to cross half the world, right, to go from somewhere in Russia to Mexico, right, and then apply for, like, if you want to come to the United States. But I also know that there are now new trajectories of migration being in place. Like, many people are now going to countries like Georgia or like Kyrgyzstan, right, in Central Asia, and just staying there, at least for the time being. And it could be, yes, it could be actually also good, like it could work, and it has worked for many now, because at least they don't need to learn a new language, since many people in this country still speak Russian well, and so they don't lose a lot, right, while immigrating. Okay.
Okay, we are just past 3:30, so I wanted to finish up maybe with just a quick question about, would it be accurate to say that we began the presentation talking about the origins of older homophobic laws. Is it accurate to say that Russia is sort of at the vanguard of a new international traditionalist movement against queer people? And is there anything that, say, lawmakers in the US or other liberal democracies that value LGBTQ rights, what they should keep in mind to counteract that?
Thank you. So, there is most definitely a transnational, if not global, movement, conservative movement against, let's quote President Putin one more time, gender freedoms, right? i.e. LGBTQ rights, right, and also transgender people's rights, and sometimes even, well, and quite often women's rights, right, reproductive rights. We often call it the anti-gender movement. And Russia has been active in this movement quite by far, but I don't know if I would necessarily call it actually to be at the vanguard, because how would you define that? For example, if we look at just one thing, and I know we don't have a lot of time, let's look at funding. Let's look at who funds the transnational anti-gender movement. There's been research into that and reports showing that, yes, the transnational anti-gender movement has received a lot of support from a coalition, or a loose coalition, that includes Russian oligarchs, but also the Catholic Church, and also, guess who? Evangelicals, American evangelicals. And the American evangelicals are the greatest funders still of the anti-gender movement worldwide. The Russian oligarchs, I believe, are number 2 or 3, if we look, so does it place Russia at the vanguard, or does it place it in, right, with this group of other significant actors who are not as, showy, right, as showy as Russian political elites, right, who may say less, right, who may be less loud, but yet at the same time very active. And I'm thinking of the Koch Foundation, right, and like many, many other initiatives, Scott Lively, and so on. So what can we learn from this? Well, I just wish that LGBTQ rights weren't something that is so easy to politicize and so easy to just weaponize even. I just wish that, that actually people in the world understood that LGBTQ people are people, like Secretary Clinton used to say, right? That they just have human rights like everyone else, and that somehow, but it seems to me that it's so easy to turn LGBTQ rights and trans rights, especially in this country, into some kind of an agenda item, right? That helps politicians just get points, right, and to win local elections, or not even federal elections. I wish it weren't like this, but it is. And so, but we will be thinking. We'll continue thinking about what we can do to improve and to maybe make things better. But I'm not sure yet. Sorry if I can't give you a straightforward and easy answer, Lenny.
No, that was a very academic answer. Thank you. And on that note, thank you everyone for attending today's discussion. We could go forever, but I am really glad that we had the time we did. And thank you to everyone online. And just to close out, I encourage you to stay up to date with the Kennan Institute with our blogs and our podcasts. And I would like to thank the Title VIII office at the U.S. State Department one last time for helping us host such talented academics as Alexandra Novitskaya. So thank you again.
Thank you, Lenny.